So we are in the middle of our August worship series entitled Signs, Divine Direction on the Road of Life. The first week in this series, we looked at how we can use Joshua's words of, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," as a lens to help us make decisions, so that in all things that we do, we are serving God. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at John the Baptist's response to his disciples' anxiety and jealousy as another guide for us. Jesus must increase, but I must decrease. We saw that we should not fear non-existent danger that would keep us from doing the things that we are called to do, but instead we can consider how we can increase our witness to Jesus while decreasing our own personal agendas so that we can serve the Lord in all that we do. Each week in this series, we are using a different type of a road sign as a metaphor to consider how we might discern God's leading in our lives. On vacation last week, I realized just how drawn I am to signage. I found myself taking pictures of signs all over the place. I love signs. Signs telling us about the plants and the wildlife that are around us. Signs pointing us in the direction of a beautiful view or a waterfall. Signs that are no longer pointing us towards the waterfall that we've been hiking towards, so we know for sure that we have made a mistake somewhere and we need to kind of rethink and retrace our steps. Our trip to Israel last summer, we saw so many signs, different kinds of signs, signs in multiple languages, signs that were labeling each place so that people would know the significance of the ground upon which they found their feet. I took a lot of pictures of signs just so that I could remember where we were when I looked back through my pictures later on. The most startling of signs that we saw on our trip to Israel were the ones that we saw on the bus ride through the West Bank. These signs were definitely not welcome signs. These were signs that communicated danger. You see, there's a no-man's zone in between the border of Israel and Syria and Jordan, and the signs make it very clear that the guards are going to shoot first and ask questions later if you find yourself in the wrong place. You really wouldn't want to accidentally walk through the wrong gate, although you would have to be completely oblivious to the barrage of signs that are all over to make that mistake. Warning, landmines. That's our sign for today. According to the signage, this zone between these borders of these nations in conflict was full of landmines. And I guess I am naive, but I was shocked by this. I thought we've made treaties where we've decided that we're no longer going to use these landmines because they're so dangerous and they pose such a threat to civilians and especially to children. In 1997, a mine ban treaty was written with the goal of eliminating the use of landmines around the world because they're so dangerous. 163 nations have signed the treaty, but not all nations have. Nations like Syria, for example, have not signed this, and they continue to use landmines in their ongoing conflicts. In countries like Afghanistan, it's not the nation, but more the non-state groups like the Taliban that continue to use landmines. Landmines are so dangerous because they hide just beneath the surface. They're not immediately visible to the naked eye, but if you trip one of them, you will suffer the consequences. I watched a video this week of a person who was in Afghanistan looking for landmines so that they could remove them. The man was using some kind of a detector to find them, and he was standing in this mountainous terrain. And really, when I looked at the video, I thought the mountains kind of reminded me of the mountains, the beautiful mountains that I had just been admiring last week. They looked beautiful on the outside, but underneath there lies danger. Landmines are used to keep people out. If you come across one, there is no doubt that you are not welcome there. The signs along the borders in the West Bank were scary and they were ominous, but I was also very thankful for them because they were warning people to stay away so they wouldn't encounter this danger. The mines in Afghanistan were hidden, and the workers had to risk their lives to detect these mines in order to remove them. They were not labeled, and so any unexpecting person or child at play could come across one of these mines inadvertently. A landmine with a warning sign is dangerous, but a landmine without a sign is all the more deadly. Our passage from Luke today is a familiar one. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me and do not stop them, for such as these the kingdom of heaven belongs." This is a beautiful verse, and I think we often sentimentalize this verse when we think of it. We like to recall Jesus and think of him welcoming cute little children into his embrace. But as much as this passage is about Jesus welcoming children, it is all the more about not getting in the way of anyone who would desire to come. This passage says, people were bringing even infants to Jesus, and this is implying that lots and lots of people were coming to Jesus. Jesus was a busy guy, and crowds gathered around him because people just wanted to see him and to hear him and to be touched by him. And so it seems that Jesus' disciples had kind of appointed themselves to be his protectors and defenders. In this passage from Luke, we see the disciples trying to be the gatekeepers, deciding who can and who cannot come near Jesus. Wow. Who are the disciples to decide who is welcome in the presence of Jesus and who is not? Who is worthy of Jesus' attention and who is a waste of time? Even in the presence of Jesus, being taught directly by Jesus himself, the disciples don't always get it right. They fought over who was more important or who was Jesus' favorite. And in our passage from today, they hindered children from getting to Jesus. The Greek word that is translated hinder or stop them in the NRSV is an interesting word. The dictionary of the New Testament defines it as to prevent by word or by act. It occurs 10 times in the Gospels, and it always occurs when people are trying to get to Jesus or they are trying to get to God, and someone is standing as a barrier rather than a bridge. The disciples were proud to say to Jesus, "We prevented people from bothering you." And Jesus responded, "Do not hinder." The disciples said, "We saw a man casting out demons in your name, and we prevented him. We stopped him from doing that." And Jesus said, "Do not hinder him or anyone from doing good in my name." Do not hinder. We should never be a barrier. We should never get in the way of anyone who wants to encounter a touch from Jesus. So perhaps this is another tool that we can put into our discernment tool belt. In all things, we can consider, is this decision that I'm about to make something that would help or would hinder someone from coming to Christ? Would this help someone or hinder someone from knowing Jesus? We want to be welcoming to all. But this week, as I was working on this message, I was wondering if sometimes in our efforts to protect our particular way of doing things, do we inadvertently keep people out or keep them from feeling welcome? Like the disciples, do we think that we are even kind of justified in this sometimes because we think somehow that we are protecting God? Now, I assume that the disciples had really good intentions. They didn't want people to get distracted. They didn't want people distracted from the important message that Jesus had to share. They didn't want these children getting in the way of Jesus' mission. They were protecting Jesus. Even with our good intentions, I wonder if sometimes we make people feel unwelcome or unworthy. And thinking about hidden landmines, I wondered, how might we keep people away inadvertently with mines that are just hidden, just barely under the surface? I've been in church services where members get really visibly upset if someone new comes and sits in their pew. They don't like it. Even if there's plenty of other places to sit, they just get a little grumpy if they can't sit in the same spot that they sit. Now, when I stand up here each week, oftentimes I see faces in similar places, but I think we do a pretty good job of making room and being welcoming if someone comes in. But I have had a visitor come here the first time and kind of pull me aside before the service and say to me, "Okay, now tell me, where can I sit so that I won't make anybody mad?" Clearly, this person has felt kind of that discomfort when they were a visitor at a church somewhere. So how do we receive those who would come? How do we receive a visitor who maybe comes dressed in a way that we don't like or we don't think is quite appropriate? How do we receive someone if they don't understand our social norms or kind of the ways that we do things around here? What do we do? How do we respond if we just don't like something about the way they're acting? Like the disciples, we can begin to feel like we need to protect God. Do we ever kind of think that maybe we need to decide who's worthy? So as a church, are we to be the gatekeeper for Jesus? Jesus repeatedly said, "Do not hinder and do not stand in the way." So rather than the gatekeepers, I think that we need to declare ourselves the welcoming committee. And if so, we need to really think, are we intentional about making people feel welcome? If our mission is to reach our neighbors, making Christ known so that we can make disciples for the transformation of the world, especially if we hope to reach people who don't have a church home, maybe people who have never been a part of a church, people who have never heard the stories that we know and hold so dear, if we want to welcome people that are very different from us, we're going to have to be okay with people doing things a little bit differently if we don't want to serve as a barrier to Jesus. The people were bringing even infants to Jesus with the hope that they would be touched by him. The Greek word for touched here is also a really interesting one. This is not an ordinary type of touch. This kind of touch is one that influences. It is a touch that would make someone change or modify them. It would alter them in some way. This word touched appears 36 times in the New Testament, and 32 of those times appear in the gospel. And they talk about times in which a touch can heal. A touch can even raise someone from the dead. And so can you blame these people for wanting to bring their children to have the chance to be touched by Jesus? This is not just an ordinary touch that they are seeking. This is not the touch like of a fan that might reach out and touch their celebrity hero or their heartthrob and think, "Oh, I'm never going to wash this hand again." It's not that kind of a touch. This is the kind of touch that makes us into something completely new, that transforms us to be like Christ. So many people desired a touch from Jesus. So who were the disciples to think that they could stand in the way of God's transforming touch? Who are we to stand in the way? Jesus goes on to tell the disciples that whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a child can never enter it. The very kingdom of God belongs to those who are like children. This had to be a shock. In the Greco-Roman world, children had a very low status. So what does it mean to enter the kingdom like a child? Perhaps entering the kingdom with the heart of a child says something to call us to humility. After all, Jesus teaches that the last will be first and the first will be last in this great gospel transformation. Children are dependent on adults for survival, and so perhaps entering the kingdom as a child means that we come completely dependent on God, and we depend on God rather than ourselves or our own pride. We've all heard the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And so Jesus is doing something incredibly new here, revolutionarily new. Jesus' ministry and the kingdom of God is kind of the ultimate new trick. The old has gone and the new is come. And so perhaps the necessity of entering the kingdom as a child means that we must remain teachable. Perhaps we must remain young in our teachability, open to new things, and not hardened in our old ways. Perhaps our old ways can be our barriers to being a part of what Christ is doing in our midst. So this week, the challenge is to think about welcoming. Think about how important it is. Try to place yourself in the shoes of a visitor. How does it feel? Where are the hidden landmines? What new things do you notice from this vantage that you hadn't seen before? What might we do differently so that we are not barriers, but a bridge to Jesus? How can we use this week's discernment tool to consider that in everything, will what I am about to do help or hinder those who would come to be touched by Jesus? One of the important ways that we eliminate barriers is through our open table. And I call this table our table, but honestly, this table is Christ's table, and we are here at his invitation. In the United Methodist Church, we celebrate an open communion, and this is an incredibly important value for me. For my personal convictions, I don't think that I would be able to serve communion in a tradition that allowed only certain people to partake while excluding others. I believe in the power of communion as a means of grace. And who would I be to stand in the way of the workings of that grace? When we come forward for communion, we anticipate meeting Christ tangibly and mysteriously through these simple elements. Can you just hear the voice of Jesus? Do not hinder those who would come to the table of grace. We serve gluten-free bread for communion here at Centennial. Now, this has not been an easy transition to make, and anyone on the worship committee can tell you that this is something we take very seriously. We've had a lot of trial, and we've had some error, and I'm sure you remember that too. We had a Sunday a few months ago where I think more bread ended up on the carpet than in our mouths. Some of it has tasted really good, and some of it not as much. But this is a work in progress, but it's important work because Jesus tells us, do not hinder those who would come. Serving wheat bread to someone with celiac or other gluten sensitivities could make them very sick, violently and dangerously sick for some people. So rather than coming to the table and finding the healing touch of Jesus, serving wheat bread to someone who has these sensitivities would be more likely to make them sick. And this would hinder some people from meeting Jesus in this holy meal. So I've been thinking about that this week and all of our trial and error in finding the right thing. What is most delicious about our gluten-free bread, in whatever form it ends up showing up at the table on any given Sunday, is that it is inclusive of all of our people. So we can know that even in this tiny way, we have not hindered someone from coming to Jesus for that transformational touch.